Welcome to the county seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are going to talk about one of the most traditional offices in county government, the county sheriff. You know, the office, or at least the functions of county sheriff, date clear back to the 9th century when the shire had an official who was elected by the people to represent the serfs' interests to the king. And that's the origin of the sheriff, and traditionally that office has stayed with us ever since. Now, the contemporary sheriff, in addition to providing law enforcement and public safety, sheriffs are also required to maintain and operate jails, engage in search and rescue, and handle other functions. So I'd like to introduce our legal expert, retired sheriff of Utah County, Jim Tracy. Where does the authority in Utah for sheriff come from?
There are two different ways that a sheriff can receive that authority. In many of the states, it comes through the Constitution of the state. There's language in that Constitution that sets forth the duties and the authorities of a sheriff. In the state of Utah, it's statutory. The office of sheriff is not defined in the Utah Constitution. So it takes its authority from the legislature, who puts that into statute. And that's found in Utah under the Utah Code Annotated, Title 17, Chapter 22. And then it has 32 different paragraphs or statutes that are listed in there that give the authority of the sheriff.
Now, out of the 50 states, 48 have sheriffs. Alaska has no counties, and Connecticut abolished counties a few years ago. So the office of sheriff varies nationwide. Now, there are 13 that are constitutionally defined. Here's some trivia for you, okay? In Kentucky and Louisiana, the sheriffs serve as the tax collector as well as the sheriff, so he comes to collect the rent, so to speak. Hawaii 5-0. You've all heard the famous 5-0. Well, McGarrett is a sheriff. It is a statewide sheriff's office. And in Indiana, the budget for feeding inmates comes out of the sheriff's salary. Are there any other stories you can think of?
Yes, for Louisiana, for instance, there are 2 sheriffs in every county, or parish. They call them parishes there. There's a law enforcement sheriff who strictly does the law enforcement authority and duties, and the other sheriff is the corrections sheriff. He runs strictly the courts and the jail.
So I guess that makes a point that when you have something statutorily defined, there can be 50 different definitions of local law enforcement, which is where we're going to pick up our conversation when we come back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today about constitutional sheriff, the office of sheriff within the state, and exactly what that means, because there does seem to be a little bit of confusion. Joining us for our discussion is a sheriff from Tooele County, Paul Wimmer, and we have Bob Stevenson, a commissioner from Davis County, and a retired sheriff from Utah County, and our resident constitutional sheriff expert, Jim Tracy. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So I want to start the conversation to kind of clear the air as far as there are some people that think that it is a John Birch far right-wing type conversation when you're talking about constitutional sheriff, as it deals with authority. And that's not really what Utah's been talking about, is it?
People sometimes ask you, are you a constitutional sheriff? And they're coming from several different mindsets. One is, are you a constitutional sheriff in regards to how you approach your law enforcement within the confines of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. And some, though, believe, because of a misreading of the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, that the sheriff is the supreme law enforcement officer in the county and supersedes federal authority. And that is a misreading of the Constitution, just frankly. I've never been able to find where that is actually true in the wording or in any of the court's interactions with sheriffs. The other one then goes to the Constitution of, is the sheriff a constitutional sheriff in the fact that is he defined with his laws and his authorities and things in the state constitution. Those are the two divergent.
You know, one of the misconceptions by the general public is that we are constitutional. And you always have to make that correction that we derive our authority from the state statute. And where we're really getting defensive as sheriffs in Utah is the last 2 years we've had to deal with legislation that has pushed for us to become appointed officials versus elected officials. And we believe that is a dangerous road to go down anytime you're taking the voice from the people and handing it off to a single body, such as a commission.
So, yeah, so realistically, I think that one of the things that has taken place is that within some sheriff's departments within the state of Utah, there has been some problems and some things that have hit the press. With this, the natural tendency is to say, why are we electing instead of appointing the individual to become the sheriff? I think that what has to be remembered is that in any organization, whether we're talking business or we're talking government, we either hire or we either elect. And when we do this, we're always trying to elect or hire the best person for the position. Sometimes that doesn't work, whether it's an appointed position or whether it's an elected position. And we have to be realistic, and I don't believe it's good business to turn around and jump to a conclusion just because you may have a couple of bad eggs within your state.
I would agree with that, but the concern I have is a separation of powers. Within the county construct, within the way the county's elected officers are put together, the commissioners in a county already are the legislative, they can do county ordinances, and they're the executive in that county. Mm-hmm. If the sheriff was taken out of the elected genre and put into an appointed department head, then you have the commission basically judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, you end up with them as a legislative authority, as the executive authority, and then if they can appoint who they would like through whatever vetting process other than voting, the sheriff through appointments, then you have subverted what I believe is the best method, which is election, to select an individual who is going to represent each individual county member by an elective authority and keep it in the elected area.
But some people would argue that the electorate doesn't really vote for anything more than a name. The guy that's got the most posters out wins the election as sheriff, at least in the larger counties. I think in a more rural county, everybody already knows who he is. And so why not make that an appointment and hold your elected officials accountable for the appointments they make?
The same argument could be made for commissioner. Why not just appoint them and have the state do it? I mean, literally, you can go up that chain until you only have one or two elected officials in the county, and then you have basically a state that's running everything. Counties are political subdivisions of the state, but they have the autonomy based on the statutory authorities right now, as long as the legislature leaves it alone, to have that differentiation and that splitting of the authority by having elected persons in all those areas: county attorney, sheriff, the recorder, and the commission.
So I believe one of the things that we have to realize is that the state of Utah right now is going through some growing pains. We are growing up, especially along the Wasatch Front. But we have to remember that the state is a very, very large area. There's a lot of rural counties that are out there, and that we have to respect the fact that if you take Cache County, I believe that Logan City is the only one that has a paid police force. So the county sheriff's department is actually running the rest of the cities and overseeing them. That becomes a very big job as far as that goes. Some of the larger, if you take Davis County, I believe out of the 15 cities, I think 12 of the 15 have their own paid police force. So it's a different dichotomy as far as what happens within a rural county with what may be happening in an urban county with how things are. And I think we have to be very careful not to jump to a conclusion based upon this situation or this situation. We have to look at the state as a whole.
I was just sitting here having a thought. We're talking about shifting the sheriff from being elected to being appointed. You'd be the guy who would have to appoint him. Is that a job that you and your fellow commissioners would want?
Well, I had the opportunity, being a past mayor of Layton City, that we actually had the police chief retire, and we did hire a new police chief. And we did go through a process of interviewing. In fact, we opened it up countrywide to see what was out there. Some of the things that we did want to make sure of is that we had a personality that would fit within our community. That became very important, but was also very, very knowledgeable with what was there. And again, we ended up with a very good police chief in Layton City at this time. At the county level, we'd have to be doing the same thing. I do agree that it does open up the opportunity to be able to look into the person's background and to be able to pick out of as many people that want to apply. But it still comes down to that question as far as that individual with everything that he's going to be doing throughout that county, and is it something that he should be answering to the people, not to the elected commissioners.
Do you think that could go astray?
Absolutely. I think the other issue that I'm trying to protect in my thought process on keeping it elected is that it keeps I would like to see the state move to the point where a sheriff's election is nonpartisan. Right now they're partisan. And so you can end up with the selected sheriff before you ever get to the main election or even to the primaries because of what comes out of the conventions for the different parties. Mm-hmm. You may not have but one single person going forward as a candidate. That then puts politics back into the center of what I should, of the office of all offices that should be non-political, mm-hmm. should be those who enforce the law. So in my thought, I would like to see the state go to like the city mayors and the school boards. They're nonpartisan races. I would like to see the sheriff office elections go to nonpartisan. That way you could protect the whims of any political party from how the law is enforced.
What do you guys think about that?
I don't know that party affiliation has a whole lot to do with my job day in and day out. I enforce the law according to the law, and obviously we have some discretion in our decision making, but you elect the person for that, not necessarily a party for that. And so I don't necessarily disagree with Jim on this. It's just one of them things where you know, I think there's argument on both sides of that fence, but I'm not really decided as to whether I should be partisan or not.
Partisan. Uh-huh. Well, that's a good point. And it's a good point for us to take a break. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about constitutional sheriff, some of the challenges that it presents, and look at some of the other areas and impacts as far as statute versus constitution. We'll be back on the county seat in just a minute. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation about the office of sheriff, whether it should be constitutional or whether we should do away with electing sheriffs altogether. In the break, we were talking about the fact that, you know, there's a change in the environment. People used to step up and say, I'm going to run for office. Is that the same case today as it used to be?
I'm of the opinion that it is becoming harder and harder to get people to run for office. There's always the concern about things that are going to be said through the campaigning process about individuals. It's also become very, very expensive. And so for people to make that decision, a lot of times to them it's not worth it. And I think that's sad. I think we should have numbers of people who are willing to step up and run for elected office.
Do you think going nonpartisan would help that?
I think there would be significant potential of it helping simply because your party affiliation, you wouldn't have the whole convention, primary, and then general issues within the parties. And someone they don't have to unseat the dominant political power within that county.
I think there's something that also falls into this category. If you were a nonpartisan election, the focus would shift from party to qualification a little bit better, would it not?
And experience. Mm-hmm.
And experience, and people would be running on a different set of criteria, and it would free people who say, I'm going to vote Republican ticket all the time to have to make a decision and vet their candidates a little bit better.
Well, and I think the thing that has to be looked at is that when you are a sheriff of a county, you're involved with the jails, you're involved with bailiffs, you're involved with the regular street patrols, you're involved with Davis County, wildland fire, I mean, it's numbers of different things that are involved. And to have that experience is very important to be able to understand how to run that department. When an individual who's been a sheriff on the street for 4 years and decides to run for county sheriff, you know, the qualifications probably aren't there for all the things that's going to be required of that individual.
No, that's a very good point. I think we're going to take one more break and come back and talk about how you go about changing the constitutionality of the sheriff's office and look at it in terms of some of the other offices. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today about the sheriff, the constitutional sheriff, what it means and what advantages there would be to making that change. In preparation for this show, I pulled out the state constitution. I read it from one end to the other. And other than governor and attorney general and a couple of other offices at the state level, there are no constitutionally defined elected offices anywhere in the Constitution, but it does refer to election processes and elective people. Is that an incongruity that probably should be changed? Because there are references to elections of local officers, but their offices are not constitutionally defined.
We would like to see it changed as county sheriffs, and I think most county elected officials would like to be, most of the elected officials would like that office written into the Constitution to be required. Because like I said, our biggest issue from the Sheriff's Association is that we deal with a piece of legislation that wants to appoint us. And we think that's unhealthy to take the voice from the people. And also, it does place the power of legislative and executive solely under one body, your county commission group, regardless of how they're structured. And so we would love to see it written in there that we are required under the Constitution to exist. That way, the voice of the people is more difficult to take away. Because in order to become constitutional sheriffs, the Constitution has to be opened up, and then also it has to pass by much more than a majority. It has to be a 2/3 vote from the legislature in order to accomplish the constitutionality of our office.
Would it be better to approach this all as an all-in-one and take the clerk auditor and some of those checks and balances that exist in county government and put them together and say we need to codify or constitutionally amend all of them at once?
I do believe that if we look back to see how long has these laws been in place, and as I said earlier, we are going through growing pains, and do we need to turn around and relook at how county government is set up? We're seeing right now that a number of counties are starting to discuss different forms of county government, which allows within the Constitution right now. Maybe what the legislature ought to do is sit down with the counties and some of the leaders and figure out what would be best to do.
And I think anytime you're talking money, I think your auditor absolutely needs to be independently elected. Obviously, law enforcement being probably the most intrusive element or the face of government to the people, we need to be constitutional, and people need to have a say on who we are. And I think the auditor would present a good balance with the legislative side approving the budget, but also to ensure all the laws are followed. Same with treasurer. I'm more of I think all of them have a place, elections. Do you want the clerk to be independently influenced?
And technically the legislature, if they got a mindset to it, they could eliminate election of all county officers.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's all statutory, and they could change the statutes.
Precisely.
That's kind of a frightening thought. Look, government should be local, so.
Well, and it takes away local control.
Yeah.
And I think most of us would agree that the best government is local government when it comes to the things that impact our lives daily, that county commissioners, that city mayors, that sheriffs and chiefs of police have to deal with. Those things should be controlled at the local level to give the best outcome.
With a direct accountability.
To the people.
Because, people can get in your face and talk to you about things as a commissioner or as a sheriff. Head of the Department of Public Safety or a U.S. Senator, that's not so easy.
Right.
So I did want to toss out one other thing in here. There's a check and a balance that would take place. And if you elect the sheriff and you say, well, he could run rogue and get completely out of hand, there still is a constraint on him because commissioners are budgeting. On the other hand, that creates an entire problem in and of itself. I'd like to address that for a minute. Do you in Tooele County come at odds with budgeting for the sheriff's office?
Yes, the system's designed to come at odds. It is part of the checks and balances. Naturally, I want the finest equipment, I want the most personnel, and there has to be a balance, because I may want the requests, that may be what we desire, and in some cases need. And so you do have to separate the needs, because the commissioners are the ones with the taxing authority. And as a sheriff, I have to respect that that is not an easy thing to do. And yes, they'll raise taxes and say, you know what, the sheriff has these needs and we're going to raise taxes on account of it. But it's a check and a balance and something that needs to exist.
Do you think that accountability could be shifted?
I do. I think that in many states that we haven't talked about, the sheriff also sets his taxing, his mill levy and his taxing amount for his revenue. And then if he's exceeding that, that the people think shouldn't be higher than what he's put it, then they can unelect him. But so in some places that has occurred and still does occur, that the sheriff is his own taxing authority. That way he's not failing to provide public safety because of a lack of budget that is not his. It's been given to him by somebody else.
How would you feel about that?
Well, I think that the commission ends up being part of the check and balance system, and I think that's very important. I think that we would make a big mistake if we turned the entire taxing entity over to the sheriff's department, or any other department for that matter. It allows them to be able to continue to increase for what they may think their needs are. I believe that it's very, very important that within any government organization that the elected people learn to work together to set goals for what they want to do, and that way there isn't a lot of confrontation. It's basically, these are the goals we're going to reach, and that's how we're going to get to it.
Gentlemen, thank you. This has been most educational. It's been very good input. This issue is likely to surface during the course of the legislature this year. It has been discussed in previous years, and we'll follow it closely. Glad you got an understanding of what we're talking about when we say constitutional sheriff here in the state of Utah. If this has been a good conversation, share it with your friends. We would love your interaction on social media. Please feel free. In fact, I encourage you to give us your points of view in our social media, where we can continue the conversation there. We'll look for you next week on The County Seat.